Hey E&D gang, hope you're having a good week. Since I couldn't be with you in class, in the classroom live on Wednesday, I did want to take a few minutes to record a short video to cover some of the material that we haven't gotten to yet, that you have hopefully read in Sacred Rhythms. And we'll talk a little bit about the Sabbath principle today, in addition, kind of supplement a little bit of what you read in Barton's chapter. But before we get to that, I did want to mention something that I'm not sure that I covered with clarity in the course of our classroom discussion, and that relates back a few chapters to when we were talking about encountering Scripture, engaging with Scripture. We talked about this process of Lectio Divina, and we talked about kind of four main movements, kind of historically, that have been a part of that process: reading, reflecting, responding, and resting, all that begin with the letter R. But then if you did and looked at it, certainly if you read, but if you did the practice section at the end of the chapter there, you saw that she kind of encapsulates that in two other kind of steps. One she calls preparation, silencio, kind of entering into this moment, silencing our spirit, kind of the thinking in our head, and spending some time just preparing our hearts and our minds to engage with Scripture. So there's kind of an initial step of preparation, and then she adds a step at the end she calls resolve, or incarnatio, but which is really the idea of living it out and fleshing that, whatever that message for me, that word for me that God has for me that I've read in the Scriptures. And so that kind of in all would give us about 6 steps in practicing a process of Lectio Divina, 4 main movements that historically have been a part of that: read, reflect, respond, and rest. But then we would kind of bookend that with the initially kind of preparation, coming into that, kind of preparing our hearts, silencing kind of all the thoughts in our head so that we can be prepared to really hear what it is that God is saying to us through the Scripture. And then ending kind of with this idea of resolve, which is kind of her way of saying, go out and live it out then. Like if God has spoken to me in this way, then I'm going to go live that out in my life, which would give you 6 steps as a whole. So if you saw maybe something on the study guide, kind of prompted you thinking like, wait, I thought there were only 4 main movements kind of historically, but then that bracketed with preparation and also resolve, or living it out, incarnatio, incarnating that word that God has for us. And so just wanted to make sure I cleared that up, since I'm not sure I was clear about that in our class time. But I wanted to spend a few minutes highlighting some key things related to this idea of Sabbath keeping and the Sabbath principle. She opens this chapter with those verses from Isaiah when God talks to the people about their need to keep the Sabbath, and in particular emphasizes that not simply as a rule or a prescription for their life that they're to keep, but actually that they will find in that then joy, that they will be living into this rhythm of life that they were created for. And again, keeping in mind kind of that God is our creator. God has shaped us and prepared us in a certain way, and therefore He has established a rhythm, in this case, kind of the rhythm of the Sabbath principle of rest and renewal, designed to help us kind of live the most abundant life that we could have. He says there in Isaiah 58, if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. But implicit kind of in this idea is something that runs against what the Sabbath can tend to become for a lot of people. And maybe you've experienced this. I certainly did in my growing up years. There were times my family certainly honored the Sabbath principle, at times almost as a legalistic kind of rule. It was kind of something you were kind of forbidden to do certain activities, even some things that may be life-giving and replenishing. It was like all about kind of this observance of a rule. But I want us to make sure that as we talk about this Sabbath idea, that we understand that biblically this is something much richer than just a keeping of a rule, but it's actually observing this principle of this rhythm of life that is more than just kind of resting for a day, but engaging in a rhythm of life, ordering one's life in such a way that we experience joy, we experience the fullness of that for which we were created. We live in a day and age when the Sabbath idea is really kind of even rarely talked about, and while for an Orthodox Jewish person, the Sabbath would be a very carefully observed kind of ritual or rhythm in their life. In the Christian tradition, particularly maybe even in the evangelical Christian tradition, we haven't often been careful with ordering our life in this same way. And yet, the Sabbath principle shows up in Scripture time and time again in significant ways. We'll use this just as an illustration. This stack of papers, I think there's 57 pages here maybe, of verses. This is a printout of all of the verses in the New Living Translation of the Bible that contain the word Sabbath. It actually shows up 158 times in 141 verses. And that's everything from the Old Testament and into the New Testament. Jesus spoke about the principle of the Sabbath. He actually confronted the Pharisees about their legalism when it came to the Sabbath, but certainly elevated the principle of the Sabbath. You have Paul mentioning that as well. So you just have an indication here when you look at the thickness of all of these papers and these verses, and you'd be welcome to take a look at this if you want to come by the office sometime. But just there's a richness, there's a frequency of mention of the Sabbath that we ought not to miss sometimes in a world, in a culture, in a society where Sabbath really doesn't exist in our broader culture. It's only something that we can grasp as a value in our tradition. On page 134, Ruth Haley Barton tells us that Sabbath keeping is more than just taking a day of rest. It's more than just stopping work. But it really kind of centers around this idea of ordering one's life around a pattern of working 6 days and then resting on the seventh, kind of this orderly pattern to life, experiencing renewal, being in some ways maybe even more effective in how we live on those 6 days of work because our body, soul, and spirit has been refreshed, replenished, rejuvenated, restored, so that we can serve with even greater energy, strength, and focus in that time. And yet it's something that a lot of us aren't careful to build into our lives. I know in reading your rules of life, some of you have instituted that as a practice you're going to seek to do this coming semester, and I commend you on that. I'm glad to hear that. But the Sabbath is something that God ordered into kind of creation, and the very creation account tells us that, and then he commanded that of his people, Israel, in establishing them as a covenant people with the Sinai covenant, and in particular what we would come to call later the Ten Commandments. God certainly emphasized that in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. We read these words, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy." And so contained in the Decalogue, in these 10 commandments that kind of part of the core prescriptions for how God's people were to live was the institution of this Sabbath day. And if you'll notice there, it's anchored in the rhythm of creation, that even God's creative work of making this world and creating human beings also is marked by working for 6 days, resting on the seventh, setting that seventh day apart as something, in this case, is holy, as something dedicated to God and to God's purposes. We see similar description in the description of what you and I know of as the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 12, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. As the Lord your God has commanded you, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your town, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." So we have, anchored in these 10 key commandments for living, this idea of observing the Sabbath. And as you see there, it involved not just kind of an individual, but it involved the family observing the Sabbath corporately together, and it included even the animals, specific mention of the domesticated animals that were used for farming, etc. So the whole household was to kind of find this day set aside to God's purposes, set aside for rejuvenation, for rest and restoration and worship, to delight in all that God was and all that God wanted for them. And so all of that to say that when we talk about the Sabbath, we're we're not merely talking about kind of a practice that some people have kind of found helpful and maybe some people would want to try, but we're finding something that's anchored kind of in the rhythm of creation. It was anchored in the guidelines, the commandments that God had given his people in his covenant relationship with them, given to Moses at the top of Mount Sinai. And so it's something that's vitally important. It's critical for God's people. It's central to how we were created. It's essential for us if we're going to experience the fullness, the abundance that God has for us. And so Barton says on page 137 that the point of the Sabbath is to honor our need for a sane rhythm of work and rest. It is to honor the body's need for rest, the spirit's need for replenishment, and the soul's need to delight itself in God for God's own sake. It begins with a willingness to acknowledge the limits of our humanness and to take steps to live more graciously within the order of things. And I would suggest to you that a key principle in all of this is that it establishes an element of trust in God, or it's lived kind of in an element of trust in God. So if our life is not just one of salvation by faith, but living by faith, there is an element of trusting God that we can cease from work for rest and restoration, knowing that God will work in our lives to provide for us in the 6 days in which we work, and to rest in his holy love for us at the rest of that time. So some Sabbath principles for us to keep in mind in setting aside or establishing this rhythm. Working 6 days, resting on the seventh. Working 6 days, resting, replenishing, rejuvenating on that seventh. Barton tells us there are three key principles that shape how we view that. She lays these out, pages 139 and 140. The first one being that we cease our work in order to rest and delight in God and in God's good gifts. And so what we do or not do on the Sabbath day should always align with this idea of its purpose, to cease our work in order to rest and to delight in God. And so we often would see the Sabbath correlated with the day on which we worship with our brothers and sisters in the faith, in our faith community, the church, and so worship is typically a part of that. If some of you end up in ministry and you are a pastor or an associate pastor in some kind of ministry role at a church, this Sunday, the day in which your church gathers for worship, may not be. In fact, is likely not to be the day in which you set aside for your Sabbath. And so that may differ from others, but the idea is that we cease from our work to really just rest, to refresh, and to delight in who God is and in God's good gift for us. Ruth Haley Barton also suggests that we establish that as a regular rhythm in our life, as regular as we can, based on the way our life is lived, to not just try to plan that out and say, well, in about 7 days or maybe 8 or 9 days, 4 days, I may take a Sabbath here or something, but to establish that as an ongoing routine, as a regular rhythm in your life. Every seventh day, I rest and do as I would do for a Sabbath day. And when possible, she says, observe that Sabbath with others, that the Sabbath observance, as we even saw a few minutes ago in the descriptions in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5, was something that even involved kind of a corporate dimension. It was something that the family, and when we read family in the context of those books of the Bible, we're understanding that to be much more than just kind of what we would call in our day the immediate family, but kind of an extended family and the tribe. This was something that everybody did corporately. It was something for us to enjoy together. It's a great time when we have families, children, and others who are part of our family to spend this time together. And inevitably, when someone is trying to figure out how to work this kind of rhythm into their life, this principle, there are decisions to be made about what then should I exclude from my day that is the Sabbath, and what should I include? What constitutes work? What constitutes rest? What replenishes, rejuvenates, re-energizes me, and what sucks the life out of me? What is it that drains me? And those are things to keep in mind. But if you read carefully in the chapter, you know that Barton gives us at least 3 examples of things that should be excluded from that. One of those is the obvious, perhaps, being work, that in the Sabbath rhythm of life was this idea of resting from our work, that which we do to support ourselves, providing rest that our body needs, and seeking that which replenishes us rather than tires us. And so whatever our work role may be, a job, the Sabbath observation is a time to kind of set that aside and exclude that. Now, in the effort, I think often well-intended effort to exclude work from the Sabbath, sometimes odd definitions of what constitutes work get made. And you see this, for example, in some of the odd prescriptions that some of the that we see in some of the rabbinic writings, the Pharisees trying to determine what constituted work on a Sabbath day. If your animal got stuck in the ditch, did you just have to leave the animal in the ditch until the next day because you didn't want to work by pulling the animal out? And I think, in some sense, some of those questions kind of miss the point of this idea that, perhaps in a more contemporary time period, we see it as, well, does mowing my lawn, does that constitute work? And I've known people in my realm of friendship and social networks who would tell you that they just, for them, any kind of lawn or yard work is work and should be excluded from the Sabbath. And yet I've also known people at times who would say, but mowing the grass or tending to the landscaping and flowers around my home actually is something I enjoy. It's not work. It's not tiresome. It's something that replenishes my spirit. And I think if that's the case, then we would want to listen to that internal dynamic in our life. If it is something that is life-giving, if it's something that energizes us, if it's something that produces joy and that we look forward to, then I would say not only ought we not exclude it, but we ought to make sure that we include it. We do that. And yet if it's something that's just another chore, if it's just another thing I have to check off the list so that I can know that I got my to-do list done today, then it probably does fall into that realm of what we would call work. And we may want to then exclude that from the day in which we are setting aside as our Sabbath and do it at another time. But work, at least work of any kind that drains us, that tires us, that fatigues us, that causes a depletion of energy, then is something that we set aside. The Sabbath is designed for renewal, among other things, rest and renewal, and so work is set aside. You may notice as well that Ruth Haley Barton suggests that we also exclude buying and selling, because she sees buying and selling as something that cultivates consumerism, as kind of the dissatisfaction of consumerism as something that gets in the way of our rejoicing in the grace and the provision of God. And so she suggests that as well, if we're buying and selling, then we're also causing someone else to have to work. And there may be points at which some of you find yourself a little bit in disagreement with her, but certainly her concern here is what restores kind of the satisfied nature of my soul? What allows me to be content instead of shopping or something like that leaves me feeling like I'm dissatisfied or I need more somehow, that I can't rest in the fullness of what God has provided for me. And then finally she says we ought to also actively and consciously set aside worry. She kind of puts this in the category of emotional rest and mental rest, not working through in our minds the worry and concern that we have over whatever needs to be done, but really to set that aside for the day and simply to rest again in the fullness of God's provision for us and in the trust and faith in Him, and not allow that to haunt us or to continue. Maybe it's not draining us physically, but draining us certainly emotionally and mentally. And then she kind of flips that and she says, okay, those are things that we ought to exclude: work and consumerism, buying and selling, and worry. But then that brings the question of, well, what then do I make sure that I include? What is it that helps make the Sabbath Sabbath-like for me? And of course, certainly part of that is she puts in the category of resting the body, replacing work with activities that are restorative, those things that replenish our energy. And she gives you some examples of what those are for her. A lot of these activities tend to be kinds of things. We all share maybe the activity of a nap as restorative, but all of these things also tend to be tied toward our personality, toward our hobbies, things that we like. But the question for you in shaping your Sabbath day would be, what replenishes and re-energizes me? For me, that may be going on a long run. It may be a bike ride along the river or through the woods, whatever the case may be. I love a good hike in the woods or something like that. It's restorative to me, but some of you may think that doesn't sound restful at all. It doesn't sound recreational. That would be work, in which case you should excluded. But as you're thinking about your own Sabbath and what you include there, it's always what will replenish, re-energize, strengthen, restore kind of our physical bodies, our ability then to do what we need to do during the week. And a nap always works for me. I used to tell the people in my church that sometimes the most spiritual thing they could do on a Sunday was to take a nap. And used to even talk about, I'm going to be spiritual this afternoon. Certainly, even though Sunday, when I was a pastor in ministry, was not my Sabbath day, I still nonetheless often found some time for a nap on a Sunday afternoon. Whatever rests the body, whatever replenishes, re-energizes. Secondly, she talks about replenishing the spirit. Those things that delight us, right? Engaging activities, those things that will not just restore kind of physical energy or rest the body, but also that which encourages our spirit, that which brings us delight. It may be reading, it may be something else, not reading books for a class that would be more in the category of work, but something that brings true delight to our spirits. And then she talks about restoring the soul, and in particular, she reminds us that including things on the Sabbath that involve worship and reflection on God's Word, something like that, would be key for all of us. And again, there may be a corporate dimension to that worship, but there could also be that individual time in the Word or extended time in prayer, whatever, assuming again that is restorative to your soul. She also puts in here something that I think is a key word for us to remember, that sometimes the observance of the Sabbath in the past has become a rigid, legalistic kind of provision. And while we want to certainly be intentional, and at times we may have to be sort of assertive in creating that space in our schedule and in our lives, we also want to make sure that we don't miss the point, though, of the Sabbath, this idea that we're to be restored. And sometimes it can become, observing the Sabbath can become, in some ways, I would suggest, a point of work, and we don't want to do that. And she mentions that as well on page 144. She says, "Do not make Sabbath keeping a weighty exercise. Explore it with delights, as though you and God are learning together how to make the day special for both of you. And then be as intentional about protecting it as you can be, but do not become rigid and legalistic about it, which ruins the whole spirit of the day." She says, she quotes then Jesus' words from Mark chapter 2, verse 27, "The Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath." So this reminder that again, the idea is not keeping it for the sake of keeping it, but keeping it as a practice in our lives that actually allows us to be restored and refreshed and rested. And one of the things that we find is that it actually makes us more productive, and we enjoy those 6 days of work and life as we step back into them. I remember talking with a man in my church a few years ago who was wrestling with this idea of setting aside a day, Sunday in his case, as a Sabbath day. And he said, I've typically used Sundays to get work projects done around the house. He said, "Pastor, I'm just not sure that I'll be able to get everything done that needs to be done on the weekend before I go back to my full-time vocational job." And he said, "But I'm willing to take a few steps and to trust God in this and just kind of see what happens." And a few weeks later, he came back to me and he said, "This is one of the best steps that I have made in my life." He said, "Now I don't know how I would do life without that Sabbath day." And for him, that involved worship with our church on Sunday mornings. It involved rest and recreation on Sunday afternoons. And then he and some other families in our church had committed every Sunday evening to getting together in a small group to study the Word together, to fellowship together, eat dinner together, and just enjoy the richness of Christian fellowship. And he said it involved setting aside an entire day in my busy schedule. And he said, I look back and he said, I find myself on Monday morning as I go back to my full-time job that I'm paid for, feeling more rested, more energized. He said, I'm more focused. I get more done in the 5 days of my work week. And he said, I've used Saturdays to do those work projects around the house. I make that a priority and a focus for me. And he said, it has truly been a blessed addition to my life. And it was just that reminder again of, if you do this, those words from Isaiah 58, if you do this, you'll delight in God. You will find joy in keeping this. If it's truly an exercise that you give yourself to in order to find that restorative aspect of Sabbath keeping, and not just keeping a rule for the sake of keeping a rule. So I'd encourage you to consider trying to find that way to create a Sabbath space in your life. It may be hard at first, and we've talked about with a lot of these practices, sometimes implementing something new requires sacrifice, it requires carving out space maybe in a busy life that we think at least doesn't have that kind of space, much like that guy from my church. But I encourage you to give it a try and see how much abundance that practice might bring to your life. It may require doing some schoolwork on Saturday to protect Sunday, if Sunday is the day that you choose to worship. I would also say this, and very important for you to remember, particularly those of you who would end up in some form of maybe local church ministry in the future. If that's the case for you in the future, Sunday will never be a good day for your Sabbath. One of the things that I found as a pastor in the local church was that Sunday was always the busiest of work days. It was always full. And even though I often took a nap on a Sunday afternoon, my Sunday mornings from early kind of through the noon hour, and then my Sunday late afternoon and evenings often were filled with ministry activities as well. Sunday was simply never a day of rest. If that's the case for you at some point in the future, I would urge you in the strongest of terms to find another day in the week that you establish as your Sabbath. For me, that was Tuesday. You'll have to find that rhythm in your own life, but I protected Tuesday zealously. I even got to the point where I did not answer my phone on Tuesdays if I didn't know that it was a family member or something like that. People in my church knew that Tuesday was Pastor Keith's Sabbath, and they would leave messages, and I always used to tell them, if you're dying, literally dying, then I will show up probably on a Tuesday at the hospital to be with you. But short of that, leave me a message. And on Wednesday morning, one of the first activities that I would do as I got back to the office was to return any phone messages from Tuesday. But I just found that if I even answered the phone on a Tuesday, oftentimes I found myself working. It was responding to someone's need, and then that triggered some thoughts in my head, and pretty soon I was working on something else. Find that day, protect it zealously from work, even good ministry work, and engage in the activities on that day that are restorative to you, that whether it's worship, personal worship, recreation, whatever it may be, give yourself those moments to rest, to be refreshed, and to delight in God and in what He has for you. I believe that if you will institute that practice in your life, you'll find that life is even better, and it's lived more in alignment with the way God has created you, and certainly the way God has called His people to establish a rhythm of life. So some thoughts on Sabbath. You read those, obviously, in the chapter on Sabbath that Barton has for us. And then we also talked a little bit about keeping a rule of life and some of the key aspects of that from chapter 9. You'll want to review that in preparation for your test. Do remember that on Monday, September the 25th, we do have an exam, our first exam that will cover stuff from Barton's book and some of the introductory stuff that we covered when we were talking about spiritual formation, definition of spiritual formation, those 4 key aspects. Make sure you know those. Purpose is what a spiritual discipline is, what that idea of training, that concept of training biblically, how that relates to this idea of spiritual formation as well, the disciplines that we use. And if you have questions on that, you can certainly email me or text me. The study guide for that will be distributed in class on Monday. And we also have that available as one of the files in Canvas, so you can download it there as well if you've misplaced that. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, God bless your ongoing efforts to be conformed to the image of His Son for the sake of others.